Hello, I am Brock Stanton. I'm an aspiring meteorologist, and today we are going to be taking a look at multiple days of upcoming severe weather. That will include this day 2 risk, as well as a more substantial day of severe weather being this day 3 risk. But switching back to our day 2 risk, we're going to see there's two areas of tornado probabilities. The main one that we'll be discussing about is this area and portions of Nebraska, southeastern South Dakota, Iowa, and southwestern Missouri. And then there's also a slight risk here across portions of eastern New Mexico and extreme western Texas, where the more notable risk will be a significant risk for hail, which we can see we have that with both risk areas as well. We are going to take a look at our HRRR first, our 18Z run. And we're just going to take a look at should be a good area to look at it. And we're going to play through, and we can see here there are some of these morning storms here, but after that robust instability will develop, and again I'll show you that in a minute. But we can see here how the HRRR fires this cluster of storms, and models are in a little bit of disagreement on whether we could see some supercellular modes within this as well. If that does happen, that would increase the tornado risk. But you can see these clusters of storms develop, damaging winds and hail all possible. Again, any discrete cell that does develop, which this model doesn't, but others do, and any discrete cell that does develop would carry a risk of significant hail and a heightened risk of tornadoes, so we could still see a tornado or two embedded within a line of storms as well. Just show the rest of that through. We can see how it will continue into the overnight hours on a more isolated basis, but they could still see a little bit of severe weather into the overnight hours. Now we're going to take a look at our instability, and we're going to see that our instability is going to be very high for this setup, and that's going to be what's driving that risk of severe thunderstorms here. We can see how as we get into the afternoon hours, we're going to have these very strong CAPE values. I mean, right along the warm front here, storms initiate further southwest, but there's mixed air CAPE values of over 5,000. That's very strong, and we can see how these storms are going to move into this environment, and that's why the CAPE starts to go away. But this strong instability will be a very big factor in our severe risk. We're going to take a look at our lapse rates next, and this will show how it's going to be favorable for a large hail threat with any discrete supercell. And we see here how we're going to have lapse rates of over 7, perhaps even over 8 degrees, dropping at over 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So that's very favorable lapse rates for very large hail. And if a discrete cell does develop, it would support that hail risk. We're now going to take a look at our 850 jet here, and we're going to see how as we move into the day on Wednesday, it's not too much early on, but as we get into the evening and overnight hours, it does increase a lot more. So we can see by 21's use is 4 o'clock Central Time, the storms are going to be developing out over here. There's not really much of a low-level jet, but as we get into 0Z, that low-level shear is going to increase quite a bit to over maybe like 30 to 40 knots. And while we can't really see it here in the sounding because of some other issues, that will serve an increasing severe weather risk with any storms that are in that environment. You can see it just continued increasing into the overnight hours. Once we get later on, though, the capping inversion will increase that warm air aloft, and that should probably cause the severe threat to become more isolated with time. Next thing, we're going to take a look at our bulk shears for this setup, and this isn't going to be too incredible, though it will be just enough to help organize storms here. You're going to see generally our values are going to be fairly low end for this event, but because our instability is going to be so strong with this setup, it's not going to take as much bulk shear as it normally may to help organize the storms just a little bit. That can kind of happen when you get higher parameters of one you won't need as much of the other. And that's the case with our bulk shear compared to our instability, I think. And the next thing we're going to take a look at is our storm relative helicity values. And this will help determine our tornado potential with any storms. And you can see how early on, even by 0Z, there's not too much, but it's really going to increase maybe after 0Z. That's when our greatest risk for tornadoes will develop. And it still is not going to be a high-end risk by any means. Generally, a few tornadoes mostly isolated in nature seems to be what's going to be on the table. That damaging winds and hail will likely be the more widespread risks. But again, any discrete cell would carry that heightened risk for tornadoes, and we could still see a tornado or two embedded within the line. Don't think because there's not a discrete cell that the tornado chance is 0. It will be a little bit lower, but it won't be 0. And we're taking a look at our 0 to 3 storm relative velocities here on our HRRR, and we're going to see again very similar to the 0 to 1. They're going to increase generally after 0Z. We're just going to look at our moisture quick, and then we're going to switch over to the NAM for this day, this risk area. And we're going to see how we're going to have very robust moisture return for this setup, though a lot of it does seem to mix out during the day. So I'll be curious to see how much mixing does occur. Sometimes the HRRR likes to overmix. That's something that the HRRR often does. It mixes out the dew points too much, so we're going to take a look at the NAM and see if it does that as well. Just going to see here, and you can see that it really doesn't mix out the dew points whatsoever. So now what I'm actually going to do, because I'm just curious here, I haven't taken a look at the wrap, but we're just going to see if the wrap mixes out the dew points at all to see exactly what other models may be showing here. And we can see the wrap tends to mix it out a little more, but there's still more moisture than what the HRRR shows. So we're just going to have to watch and see how much that ends up happening. Again, we're just going to take a look at it a little bit more here and just see what models are showing for the moisture return, see how it ends up mixing out or not. And generally what I'm seeing is that there's going to be sufficient moisture. There's not going to be a lack of moisture like what the HRRR shows, but that mixing out could limit the moisture to some extent. That's what I'm seeing from that. I got distracted a little bit there, but now we're going to take a look at our reflectivity output on the NAM. Just see what storms it does fire. And we're going to see that it fires these clusters of storms here. I'm actually on 12Z. Let's go to 18Z. You can see on the 12Z it fired a little more linear mode, but on the 18Z, we're going to see it fires these clusters of storms, but it also does try and fire a supercell or two. You can see that here. And then it does eventually weaken. We still have this strong Boeing segment here. And if a Boeing segment like this develops, I'm not sure one will, but we could maybe see slightly higher wind probabilities if confidence develops in that happening. I'm not sure it will, but if a solution like this panned out, we could maybe see an enhanced risk for wind if we do trend towards having a Boeing segment form, say on this particular model run across portions of southwestern Minnesota. I'm just going to play this through the rest of the way, and we can see how that will weaken with time. And then, now that we saw how it played on reflectivity, let's kind of see what went into that. And we're going to take a look at our CAPE, and because it didn't mix out the moisture as much, I'm very confident it's going to be a much higher amount. And we can see that, yeah, the NAM just keeps these values of 3,500, perhaps even over 4,000 CAPE, mixed air CAPE, across this, across the entire warm sector compared to it becoming much more limited and narrow. And we can see that the turning of the winds aren't going to be too great here. We can see generally for tornadoes and supercell storms, we want them to turn kind of like this was what we're seeing with my mouse. I want a steady clockwise turn. But here it kind of just goes all over the place in the low levels, and that's what could lead to that upscale growth of lines. But in that lowest level, we do have that turning of the hodograph, which does suggest we could still have it with an isolated tornado threat with any storm that becomes inflow dominant. So we're also going to take a look at our lapse rates, and they will be very similar to the HRRR. We can see they're going to be perhaps even over 8 kilometers here. This is going to be very favorable for large hail with any discrete cell that does develop. Again, we saw that 18Z NAM did fire that one supercell. I believe it was in northwestern Iowa, though it could really develop anywhere reasonably within that line of storms. We'll just kind of have to wait and see if that does end up happening. Next thing we're going to take a look at, though, is our 850 jet. And we're just going to see how that kind of plays out. And we can see that our NAM has it a little stronger early on, but overall it's a pretty similar evolution of it increasing with time into the overnight hours. Let's just take a sounding at 1Z here. see what it looks like. And we can see there will be enough turning in that hodograph to support that tornado risk, and the winds aren't quite as veered as we were on that other sounding we took, but still not the most favorable for supercell storms, and that's why even on the NAM where that discrete cell does evolve, we're still seeing storms evolve up into clusters, and that's probably why that is happening. We're now going to take a look at our bulk shear, and our lack of bulk shear is probably another reason why we're not seeing supercell storms. I should mention that as well, is that while our bulk shear, again, it's a little more in the NAM, it's still generally less than 35 knots, and that's going to limit our chance for storms to organize into supercells. So the combination of really not that favorable changing of winds with height, as well as the increasing of that, so our general overall lack of wind shear in the mid to upper levels, is going to limit our chances for storms to organize into supercells, but the ones that do manage to do so would have an increased chance of a few tornadoes. We're now going to take a look at our storm relative helicity values, and we're going to see that, again, they're really going to increase with time as that low-level jet increases. You know, this is by 1Z. This is about 8 o'clock Central Time. You can see how they become more favorable for tornadoes, or 0 to 3 will be very similar. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to show that because we're now going to take a look at the area further southwest into Texas, because I still want to cover that bigger day of severe weather, the day 3 risk as well. So, and I'm trying to not make this video like 30 minutes long, so we'll see. You'll know how long it is when you click on it, but yeah. And then this is our severe weather that's going to be ongoing tonight on the NAM. We can see they actually upgraded it to a 30% for wind, 30% significant. So wind threat has increased with that that is the video I uploaded yesterday. The wind threat increased a lot between the recording and the time of it ongoing. But we can see as we get into the day on Wednesday, so it'll be May 11th, we can see that these cells do try and develop, generally pretty isolated in nature, maybe developing into a cluster or two later on in their life cycle. And those would carry the risk for, especially the more discrete cells, very large hail, damaging winds, and maybe further south where there's going to be greater moisture, a brief weak tornado, but overall it seems to be a damaging wind and hail risk. You can see that's how our reflectivity plays out. We're now going to take a look at our CAPE. And I will say our NAM does have more CAPE than our HRRR. I'm not 100% sure which solution is going to pan out, but just keep that in mind. There's still a little bit of details to be worked out, and that's generally to do with how much moisture there's going to be available with this system, because the HRRR mixes out a lot more moisture than the NAM, and as such has a lot less instability. But on our NAM, we're going to see we're going to have moderate instability here, and as such this would probably support a risk for large hail. And we can see we don't have too large of a hodograph at this time. And that's why I think one of the many reasons why I think our tornado potential is going to be quite low with this setup. Another one is here, look, 90/56. That's just not enough moisture return to get a surface-based storm, or a storm that doesn't have the base of the storm will just be too high to get a tornado. We are also going to take a look at our 850 winds. And again, we're going to see that they're not going to be too favorable for tornadoes. Perhaps this localized area down here, and I believe that's roughly where our 2% is. Yeah, right down there. This area will have locally greater 850 winds, so if there were to be a tornado, it would likely be down in here. Though the chances of that are still fairly low at this point. You can see the 850 winds, they will increase some with time, but even by then I imagine our capping inversion will be increasing. I'm going to check that just to confirm quickly. Let's see, so yeah, it erodes some during the day, but then look by 2Z when our 850 winds have increased a bunch, here comes our capping inversion back in to weaken any surface-based storm. So that really just tells me there's not going to be a tornado threat. And severe threat would likely be ending by then anyway, despite the 850 jet increasing. We are going to take a look at our moisture return in the system quickly, and we're going to see how the moisture, it does mix out on the NAM, but not as much as the HRRR. And speaking of the HRRR, we are going to show that now. And you can see as we get into the afternoon that the moisture just mixes out even more, and even, look, in eastern New Mexico, where there's currently a slight risk, there's dew points in the 40s, or maybe even in the 30s. So the HRRR has much less moisture, and that would limit the severe threat some with this. Just pull up the reflectivity to see how the HRRR handles convection for this day. And we can see it fires isolated storms, the scattered storms, but they really struggle to mature because there's just not enough moisture to really get robust thunderstorms, given the other ingredients. And we can see, with there being little moisture, there's just not nearly as much CAPE, and the big thing is the CAPE axis doesn't spread as far west. Instability axis just gets super messy with time, and again, we're going to take a look at our 850 jet, and we're probably going to see a pretty similar depiction, how there is going to be this localized area down here that may develop. You can see that this is that little bit of increase, not nearly as much on the HRRR as the NAM, and then this 850 jet increases overnight, but by then the severe threat would be ending because of the capping inversion anyway. And because our 850 jet is going to be weak throughout most of the period, we know we're not going to have too much storm relative helicity values, SRH values. And we're also going to take a look at our bulk shear quickly. And I believe this isn't going to be too favorable. Yeah, we're going to see our values. I mean, that can support severe weather, but storms may not become robust supercells because there's just not too much shear in place. But we're not going to be taking a look at our day 2 risk on the, we're going to go back to the NAM 3K for that. So now we're going to be looking at Thursday on the NAM now for severe weather. And again, that's our previous day, it's a Wednesday. But as we get into the day on Thursday, we're going to see these storms do develop. And I just want to say that I'm going to show another model in a second that's going to show a potentially more substantial outcome, though we can't see as far, and that's why I'm choosing to show the NAM first, is you can see these storms develop, they organize into a line, but then, and I believe it's because of the capping inversion increasing, that these storms just kind of become all messy, likely become elevated, and become more of an isolated to maybe scattered damaging winds that compared to a more substantial severe weather threat that the FV3 develops. But we'll stick with the NAM for now. And I just want to show the capping inversion so that you see what it is, so then when I compare it to the FV3, you can see the differences. So as we get into the day on Thursday, we're going to see how the cap erodes, especially right in this corridor here. But for the most part, it stays in this area further east. So then, when it turns to nighttime, it only increases. And that's going to make it basically impossible to get a surface-based storm. The storms ongoing will likely become elevated, and that will really increase our it will really decrease our chance for damaging winds and will eliminate any risk of a tornado. But despite that capping inversion, there'll still be severe weather because of these other parameters I'm about to show you. And if the capping inversion is much weaker, like some other models are hinting at, and I tend to think would be more likely to be the case, sometimes the NAM seems to overdo the capping inversion. But I just want to show these parameters, even though this shows a lesser solution, to keep in mind that if we just tweak a thing or two with this model, how we can end up getting a more robust severe weather threat. Certainly what the Storm Prediction Center tends to favor with that 30% significant. So one of those parameters I wanted to show you was the 850 jet, and we're just going to see how as we get into the day on Thursday, maybe when initially storms are firing further west, they're not going to have that. But really, especially at the time we get to 0Z, here's our storms here. Here's our 850 jet. And you can see how it increases quite a bit, and that would support the risk for damaging winds and tornadoes within that line. Again, the NAM kind of messes, the line gets all messy because of there being too much convective inhibition or a capping inversion. But I right now don't think that will be the case. So we'll see. It's definitely something to monitor. But that 850 jet being quite strong here, let's just see what it is at 0Z again for reference. We have it at well over 45 knots, even like a 45 to 55 knot low level jet. That is going to support tornado risk, especially with any storm that could develop along the warm front here, which we'll be able to show that to you by taking a look at our dew points again. A lot of the ingredients do seem to be coming together for a more significant severe weather event this day. But you can see here along the warm front, any storm that could ride it, there will be greater SRH values, which again I'll show you in a minute. Along this warm front boundary here, that would probably be where there's the greatest risk for tornadoes. We're more confident in that damaging wind and hail risk right now, though given our strong 850 jet, and especially along the warm front, those stronger storm relative helicity values, we could end up seeing a potentially significant tornado risk evolve. We just don't really have the details with that right now, but at least some of the ingredients appear to be there. We're taking a look at our CAPE, and this is another thing that's going for this setup is, you can see by daytime heating, peak daytime heating 21Z, this is 4 o'clock. Look at these values over 3,000, even in localized areas over 4,000. This is a very strong instability axis with this, and we can see how even by, this is going to be 8 o'clock Central Time, you can still see how there's still robust instability, and with that increasing low-level wind shear, that would still continue that risk for severe weather, assuming the capping inversion is less than what the NAM currently shows. So taking a look at our storm relative helicity values, we're going to see how they're going to be strong really all throughout the day, especially along the warm front here. That's where if a storm can develop, there'll probably be the greatest risk for a tornado because of that. But we're going to see how, especially after 0Z, how even further south the environment does become somewhat favorable for tornadoes based on our storm relative helicity values further south. And again, on the NAM, we have to keep in mind the capping inversion is too strong, but that other models show it being weaker and that could still support a surface-based storm. So now we're on the FV3, and we just want to compare this to the NAM, especially on the capping inversion front. That's really all I really have time for today, unfortunately. But we're going to see how on Thursday, we get into the afternoon, how that capping inversion is going to erode much, much more. And we can see how, look at by 0Z. This is all that it goes as far as the model goes out. But we can see there's no capping inversion. And if we compare this at 0Z compared to 0Z of the NAM, go back to 18Z for that. We can see how there's just such a remarkable difference. We go from a cap that likely wouldn't support surface-based storms to one where there could be widespread thunderstorms, or there's probably not going to be thunderstorms in that environment. They're going to be further west, marching eastward throughout it, but that they would still sustain surface-based storms. It's a very, very jarring difference. And then just with that, we're going to take a look at our reflectivity output quickly and just kind of show how that translates. Again, we can only show it through 0Z or about 7 o'clock Central Time, which is unfortunate, but I'll be able to do a more detailed update on this tomorrow. So hopefully I'll be able to upload that, and that will be much better. But we can see how these cells do develop, and I can confidently tell you that if this model ran 6 more hours, the storms would be much more organized and would be surface-based and carry that risk of a tornado risk, especially up and along that warm front. That's where the potentially more substantial tornado risk would evolve. And then potentially widespread damaging wind risk with these storms here as they move eastward. I do tend to favor that. But that is the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing and following me on Twitter. That should be linked in the description as long as I don't forget. And then I will see you next time. Bye.